No European monarch turned his personal life into a force capable of reshaping the destiny of an entire nation as radically as Henry VIII. His reign is not merely the story of 6 marriages. It is an era in which the king's personal desires became entangled with religion, politics, wars, and the fate of thousands. It is the story of a man who began as the ideal Renaissance prince and ended as a suspicious and ruthless tyrant, leaving behind a fractured country. The end of the 15th century. England is only beginning to recover from decades of bloodshed known as the Wars of the Roses. These conflicts drained the nation, wiped out much of the aristocracy, and left a deep psychological scar on society. It is against this backdrop that a new dynasty rises to power, the Tudors. The father of the future king, Henry VII, was a cautious and calculating ruler. He understood that to keep the throne, he needed stability, control over the nobility, and a strong financial system. His policies were pragmatic and at times harsh, but they laid the foundation upon which his son would rule. On June 28, 1491, in Greenwich, the king's second son is born, Henry. At that moment, no one saw him as a future ruler. The heir was his older brother Arthur, raised to be king. Henry, meanwhile, received the education of a younger son, languages, music, theology, and philosophy. He spoke Latin and French, played the lute, wrote poetry, and showed a lively interest in Europe's intellectual life. He was a quintessential Renaissance prince, educated, energetic, and ambitious. But in 1502, everything changes. Arthur dies shortly after his wedding. The cause of his death remains debated, but the consequences were clear. 10-year-old Henry becomes the heir to the throne. This event not only altered his destiny, but also laid the groundwork for future tragedies. Along with the title of heir came a political alliance with Spain, through marriage to his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. This marriage was not about love, it was about diplomacy. Catherine was the daughter of powerful Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. An alliance with Spain strengthened England's position in Europe. However, the church forbade marriage to a brother's widow, and so a special papal dispensation was required. Even at this early stage, Henry's future personal life was already entangled in religious and political contradictions. In 1509, Henry VII dies, and 18-year-old Henry VIII becomes king. His accession is met with enthusiasm. Unlike his cautious and restrained father, the new king is energetic, charismatic, and generous. He hosts tournaments, feasts, and hunts, lavishly distributes gifts, and creates an atmosphere of brilliance at court. The young Henry wants to be the perfect monarch, a knight, a patron of the arts, and a victor on the battlefield. Almost immediately after his coronation, he marries Catherine of Aragon. At first, their union appears harmonious. Catherine is intelligent, well-educated, deeply religious, and strong-willed. She even serves as regent while Henry is at war. Yet beneath the facade of stability lies a problem that will become the king's obsession, the absence of a male heir. Catherine endures multiple pregnancies, but most of the children die shortly after birth. The only surviving child is a daughter, future Queen Mary I, born in 1516. For Henry, this is not enough. In the wake of recent dynastic instability, the lack of a son is seen as a threat to the country's future. At the same time, Henry seeks to prove himself as a military leader. In 1513, he launches a campaign in France. This expedition is part of a complex European political landscape in which England is trying to assert its influence. During this campaign, the Battle of the Spurs takes place, where French forces retreat, giving Henry a symbolic victory. Although its strategic importance is limited, for the king, it becomes validation of his chivalric ideal. Meanwhile, in England during his absence, Catherine proves herself a capable ruler. She organizes the defense against a Scottish invasion and English forces when the Battle of Flodden. This victory strengthens her authority, but it also demonstrates that she can govern without the king, a fact that Henry may later have viewed with unease. Henry VIII's court gradually becomes a center of luxury and intrigue. A unique culture takes shape, where power is measured not only by titles, but by proximity to the king. Courtiers compete for his attention, form alliances, and weave conspiracies. Any mistake can cost a career and sometimes a life. In this world, favorites rise quickly and fall just as fast. By the 1520s, Henry's character begins to change. His confidence hardens into stubbornness, and his desire for glory turns into intolerance of failure. The absence of an heir weighs on him more and more. He begins searching for answers in religious texts, convincing himself that his marriage to Catherine was sinful from the start. It is during this period that a woman appears at court who will change everything, and Boleyn. She is not a typical favorite. Raised at the French court, she possesses sharp intelligence, charisma, and political instinct. Unlike other women, and refuses to become the king's mistress, insisting instead on marriage. For Henry, this becomes a challenge. His feelings for and gradually turn into obsession. He writes her letters, promises her a crown, and begins a campaign to annul his marriage to Catherine. This process, known as the King's Great Matter, drags on for years. Henry appeals to the Pope for an annulment. But the situation is complicated by international politics. The Pope is under the influence of Emperor Charles V, who is Catherine's nephew. As a result, the Pope refuses Henry. This refusal becomes a turning point. A king accustomed to getting everything he wants now faces a limit to his power. And instead of retreating, he decides to change the rules of the game. In the 1530s, a process begins that will forever change England. Henry gradually breaks from Rome. The culmination comes in 1534 with the Act of Supremacy, which proclaims the king as the head of the Church of England. This decision has enormous consequences. It means not only a religious break, but also a redistribution of power and wealth. The dissolution of the monasteries begins, strengthening the nobility while stripping the poor of vital social support. For ordinary people, it brings instability and fear. Against this backdrop, Henry finally marries Boleyn. But history repeats itself. Instead of the long-awaited son, she gives birth to a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. Gradually, the king's attitude toward him changes. Love turns into disappointment, and then into suspicion. In 1536, Boleyn is arrested. She is accused of treason, witchcraft, and conspiracy against the king. Most historians agree these charges were fabricated. But in a system where the king's word is law, the outcome is inevitable and is executed. This moment becomes a symbol of how dangerous Henry's power has become. His personal life is no longer merely personal. It has become a tool of politics and fear. And this was only the beginning. The execution of Boleyn in May 1536 was not just a personal tragedy for the king, but the moment when fear firmly established itself as the primary instrument of power at Henry VIII's court. Those who had only recently stood at the height of influence now understood. Their position depended not on merit, but on the monarch's mood. And within days of Anne's execution, the king enters into a new marriage with Jane Seymour. Jane is the complete opposite of her predecessor. Modest, quiet, and devoid of political ambition, she embodies the ideal of femininity Henry now seeks. Unlike Boleyn, Jane does not argue, does not challenge, and does not attempt to influence politics. Her primary role becomes what Catherine and Anne had failed to achieve for so long, the birth of an heir. In October 1537, Jane Seymour gives birth to a son, the future Edward VI. This moment is Henry's triumph. The long-awaited heir has finally arrived, and it seems the central problem of his life has been solved. But joy quickly turns to tragedy. Just days after childbirth, Jane dies from postnatal complications. Jane's death profoundly affects Henry. For the first time in many years, he appears to experience genuine loss. Historians often note that he considered Jane his true wife. Later, he orders to be buried beside her, a rare sign of constancy in a man known for his volatility. But even this tragedy does not soften the king for long. On the contrary, by the late 1530s, his rule grows increasingly harsh and suspicious. A major role in this is played by his chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell, the architect of religious reforms and one of the most powerful men in England. He oversees the dissolution of the monasteries, a vast campaign in which church lands and wealth are transferred to the crown. For the state, this brings enormous revenue. But for ordinary people, the consequences are devastating. Monasteries had provided social support, helping the poor, treating the sick, and sheltering travelers. Their closure leaves thousands without aid. Discontent grows, and in 1536 to 1537, the largest uprising of the era erupts, the Pilgrimage of Grace. Thousands of people, including peasants, clergy, and even members of the nobility, rise against the reforms. They demand the restoration of monasteries and a return to the old faith. Henry initially negotiates, promises pardon, but then breaks his word. The rebellion is brutally suppressed, and its leaders are executed. This episode cements his reputation as a ruler who tolerates no resistance. Meanwhile, the struggle for influence at court continues. After Jane Seymour's death, Henry is without a wife again, and the question of remarriage becomes political once more. At Cromwell's initiative, a search begins among European princesses. The choice falls on Anne of Cleves, sister of the Duke of Cleves, whose alliance could strengthen England's position against Catholic powers. In 1540, Henry marries Anne of Cleves, but the marriage proves unsuccessful from the start. Upon meeting her, the king is disappointed by her appearance. Their union is never fully consummated. Within months, the marriage is annulled, and, showing remarkable wisdom, agrees to the arrangement and retains the king's favor, receiving the title, the king's sister, and generous support. But for Thomas Cromwell, this episode becomes fatal. His political enemies use the failed marriage as grounds for accusations. In the same year, 1540, he is arrested and executed. Thus, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom falls victim to the very system he helped create. Almost immediately after the annulment, Henry enters yet another marriage with Catherine Howard. She is young, beautiful, and comes from a powerful aristocratic family. At court, she is seen as a symbol of a return to lightness and joy after years of grim reforms and executions. But beneath this apparent carefree image lies danger. Catherine possesses neither Jane's caution nor Anne Boleyn's political acumen. Her past, and later her behavior at court, leads to accusations of infidelity. In 1542, she is arrested. The investigation quickly leads to a guilty verdict, and Catherine Howard, like Anne Boleyn, is executed. By this time, Henry has changed dramatically. An injury he suffered in 1536 during a tournament never healed, causing constant pain. He gains weight rapidly, suffers from ulcers, and likely from chronic infections. His physical condition affects his mind. He becomes increasingly irritable, suspicious, and withdrawn. The court, once filled with celebration and chivalric tournaments, is now a place of tension and fear. Courtiers weigh every word carefully. A mistake can cost a life. Executions are no longer exceptions. They are part of political reality. Life for ordinary people is also harsh. Beyond religious upheaval, the country faces economic difficulties. Rising prices, unemployment caused by the dissolution of monasteries, and increased taxation worsen conditions. The king's power is felt not only through laws, but through fear of punishment. Nevertheless, Henry continues to play an active role in international politics. In 1544, he launches another war against France, seeking to restore English influence on the continent. The campaign leads to the capture of Boulogne, but the victory is costly and brings no lasting benefit. The war drains the treasury and increases economic pressure within the country. Henry's final marriage takes place in 1543 to Catherine Parr. She is a widow, educated, intelligent, and interested in religious reform. Unlike his previous wives, Catherine shows caution and diplomacy. She not only survives, but plays an important role in the upbringing of the king's children, including England's future rulers. By this time, Henry is far removed from the young prince who once dazzled European courts. His body is weakened by illness, and his mind strained by years of power. He increasingly relies on mechanical aids to move. His wounds refuse to heal, and his temperament becomes ever more unpredictable. Yet he continues to control the state until his final days. His decisions still determine the fate of many. Even in his last years, he retains the ability to inspire fear and obedience. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII dies. He is 55 years old. He leaves behind a country that is no longer the England he inherited. The break with Rome, the redistribution of wealth, the strengthening of royal power, and an atmosphere of fear, all of this becomes part of his legacy. But perhaps the most striking fact is that all of these changes began with a personal desire. the desire to have an heir and to be loved. His life shows how a ruler's private passions can become a force capable of altering the fate of millions. And it is precisely this that makes the story of Henry VIII not just the story of a king, but the story of a man in whom power and weakness became inseparable. This is a man who outlived everyone he loved and destroyed many who loved him. 6 wives, 2 executed, 1 died in childbirth, 1 cast aside, 1 outlived him. But it's not only about them. During his reign, England changed forever. The break with the Catholic Church, the creation of the Church of England, the dissolution of the monasteries, the redistribution of wealth, the suppression of uprisings. All of this was not merely policy. It was a reflection of his will, and perhaps his fear. The fear of dying without an heir. The fear of losing power. The fear that his name would vanish. But in trying to control everything, he created a world he could no longer control.